You lie on a bed of velvet, your body stiff in the heavy gown forced upon you. Outside, bells toll for celebration, though to you they sound more like funeral chimes. The chamber door creaks open, and the women of the court enter, their faces painted with smiles that do not touch their eyes. They lift you, adjust your veil, whisper hollow congratulations. Tonight is your wedding night. Tonight you will be given to a king. But this is no fairy tale. For the man waiting beyond those doors is not a stranger, nor even a distant cousin. He is your own grandfather. This is not myth, nor legend. This is history, raw, unsettling, and true. The obsession of Europe's royal houses with bloodlines and dynasties birthed marriages that defied both morality and nature. To keep thrones secure, they turned daughters into pawns, nieces into wives, and in this most disturbing case, a granddaughter into a bride. Tonight, we uncover the real story of the king who married his own blood, not for love, but for power. We will step into the gilded halls of the Spanish Habsburgs, into a world where family was both dynasty and prison, where the price of pure blood was generations of suffering. But before we step fully into this chapter, let me welcome you to Whispers of History. Here, we awaken the forgotten voices and forbidden stories of the past. If you are listening now, wandering these haunted corridors of memory with me, I invite you to subscribe so that these whispers continue to reach you. And tell me, as you listen tonight, where are you hearing this from? What hour of night holds you as these hidden truths unfold? It amazes me how such shadows of history stretch across oceans and centuries to find their echo in you. The story begins in Spain, in the shadow of one of Europe's most infamous dynasties, the Habsburgs. For centuries they ruled vast lands, from Austria to Spain, their power unmatched. Yet behind their crowns lay a secret, one written not in marble, but in blood. Determined to keep their thrones secure, they practiced a policy of relentless intermarriage. Uncles married nieces, cousins wed cousins, aunts became stepmothers to their own kin. It was a cycle so obsessive that by the time of Charles II of Spain, the dynasty was collapsing under its own bloodline. Children were born sickly, jaws distorted, minds unstable, the cost of keeping power pure. Into this world of decaying majesty steps the king of our story. A monarch whose hunger for control outweighed both morality and paternal duty. His own granddaughter, a girl raised beneath his gaze, would become the victim of his ambition. Her fate was sealed not by choice, not by desire, but by the signature of men who believed bloodlines mattered more than human lives. She was still little more than a child when the decision was made. Courtiers whispered of alliances, of threats from France and Austria, of thrones that might slip from their grasp if the bloodline weakened. Priests, summoned to justify the unholy, spoke of divine order, of God's blessing upon royal unions, even those that would horrify ordinary believers. And so the plans were set. A granddaughter would be transformed into a queen. A wedding feast would conceal a betrayal, and the chronicles of history would record it as nothing more than strategy. Imagine her standing there, veiled in white, before an altar gilded with gold. Behind her, priests chanting blessings. Before her, the wrinkled hand of a man she once called grandfather. The court would cheer, the bells would toll, and Europe would whisper, not of love, not of joy, but of the lengths to which kings would go to chain destiny to their blood. And in that moment, a girl became a bride, a granddaughter became a wife, and history took one of its darkest vows. The marriage of a king to his own granddaughter did not emerge from madness alone. It was the product of centuries of dynastic obsession. A family so determined to keep their crowns untouchable that they poisoned their own blood. To understand how a girl could be forced into such a union, we must step into the world of the Spanish Habsburgs. From the 16th century onward, the Habsburgs ruled half of Europe. Their empire stretched from the silver mines of the Americas to the mountains of Austria, from the Netherlands to Italy. Yet their greatest fear was not invasion nor rebellion, but dilution. To them, foreign blood threatened the purity of their dynasty. And so, generation after generation, they turned inward. Uncles wed nieces. Cousins became husbands and wives. By the 17th century, the pattern was clear. The family tree was no tree at all, but a knot of repeated names and tangled branches. The results were devastating. Look closely at the portraits that still hang in Madrid's Prado Museum. The faces tell the story. Jaws jutted forward, lips drooping, eyes heavy-lidded. The infamous Habsburg jaw, the product of relentless inbreeding, marked every heir. Behind the painted finery lay fragility. Children who rarely survived past infancy, adults plagued by seizures, kings too sickly to rule their empires. The most tragic example was Charles II of Spain, known to history as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. He was the final king of Spain's Habsburg line. Born so deformed and mentally impaired, the Whispers claimed he was cursed. In truth, the curse was not sorcery, but blood. Generations of incest that left him barren, his body frail, his mind clouded. When he died in 1700 without an heir, it plunged Europe into crisis. But the Habsburgs had left a legacy far darker than one man's suffering. They had created a culture where marriages were no longer about companionship, nor even about alliances, but about entrapment. Blood was a prison, and family ties were shackles. It was within this world that the king of our story, desperate to maintain control, would take the unthinkable step of marrying his own granddaughter. The church, which might have condemned such unions, instead bent to royal will. Papal dispensations were granted again and again, excusing unions between uncle and niece, aunt and nephew. Priests blessed weddings that would have horrified ordinary believers, cloaking political strategy in the language of divine order. God's will, they preached, was written not in scripture, but in dynastic survival. And so the granddaughter was chosen. Her name whispered in council, her fate decided by men who weighed her bloodline like coin. She would not be given to a foreign prince, nor to a noble ally, but to the very man who had once held her as a child, her own grandfather, now king. Imagine her confusion when the truth was revealed. To be told that she would become queen, not beside a stranger, but beside the man whose face had loomed over her cradle. To be dressed in wedding robes, not for a husband of her choosing, but for the patriarch of her own bloodline. To know that every smile in the court concealed a grimace, every cheer hid disgust, every prayer at the altar masked unease. But in the gilded halls of Spain, such discomfort meant nothing. What mattered was power, and power demanded that family ties bend, twist, and break. The wedding was set. Bells rang across the city. Nobles filled the cathedral. Priests raised their hands in blessing. And as the bride stepped forward, veiled and trembling, Europe whispered, this was not love. This was not destiny. This was dynastic madness made flesh. A granddaughter would call her grandfather husband. A king would turn his own blood into his bride. And a family already broken by obsession would descend one step further into darkness. The day of the wedding dawned not with joy, but with a heaviness that seemed to settle over the city like fog. Bells tolled across Madrid, their peals echoing through narrow streets, summoning nobles, clergy, and commoners alike. To the people, it was a spectacle, another royal ceremony, another chance to glimpse velvet robes and jeweled crowns. But to those within the palace, the air was different. The whispers had already spread. This was no ordinary wedding. This was a union that defied blood, faith, and decency. Inside the cathedral, the space glowed with candlelight. Gold gleamed on every altar, incense curled in the air, and priests in their finest vestments lined the aisles. Nobles filled the pews, their faces masks of forced composure. They bowed when commanded, smiled when observed, but in their eyes flickered unease. They knew the truth. The bride was no foreign princess, no distant cousin. She was the king's own granddaughter. At the far end of the aisle stood the groom. a man aged by rule and burden, his hair streaked with grey, his hand heavy on the staff of office. He wore not the attire of a grandfather, but of a sovereign, a mantle of velvet, a chain of gold, a crown that weighed heavily upon his head. His face betrayed nothing, not shame, not doubt, only the cold certainty of a man who believed the throne excused all. And then the doors opened. The bride entered, her veil cascading down to the floor, her gown heavy with pearls and embroidery. The hush that fell over the congregation was palpable. Behind the lace, she walked slowly, each step deliberate, though her hands trembled against the bouquet she carried. She was young, far too young, her face pale beneath the veil, her lips pressed tightly as if to keep from breaking. To the watching court, it was both spectacle and scandal. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others muttered prayers beneath their breath. A few dared to glance at one another, their eyes speaking what their tongues could not. This was not a wedding blessed by love or even by custom. This was dynastic madness wrapped in silk and incense. The ceremony began. Priests recited vows, their voices echoing against the cathedral walls. They spoke of God's blessing upon holy matrimony, of the sacred bond between husband and wife. Yet beneath the solemn words lay a truth too grotesque to ignore. This was no union of equals. It was the binding of blood to blood, a chain tightened in the name of power. As the vows were exchanged, silence pressed like stone upon the room. The king's voice was firm, unshaken, as he repeated the words that bound his granddaughter to him as wife. Her voice, by contrast, was soft, almost inaudible, a whisper carried more by duty than will. When the rings were placed upon their fingers, a ripple of unease spread through the congregation, but no one spoke, no one dared. The moment of blessing arrived. The priest raised his hands high, declaring the marriage sanctified by heaven itself. The choir sang, the organ thundered, and the bells outside erupted in celebration. To the world beyond the cathedral, it was a day of triumph, a wedding meant to secure dynastic strength. But within the hearts of those who truly saw, it was a day of betrayal. A granddaughter had been forced to become a bride. That night, the feasts began. Tables groaned beneath platters of roasted meats and sweet confections. Goblets of wine spilled over in endless toasts. Courtiers danced, laughed, and pretended that the unease gnawing at their stomachs did not exist. But behind the music and merriment lingered a silence that no lute or drum could drown. For everyone knew the truth. After the feast, after the dancing, after the last toast was raised, the bride would be led to her chambers, and there the reality of the marriage would reveal itself. A king would climb into the bed of his granddaughter. A young girl would be forced into the role of queen, not by destiny, but by betrayal. And the chronicles of history would record it not as horror, but as strategy. The wedding feast ended in a blur of music and wine. Courtiers stumbled from the hall, their laughter forced, their eyes lowered, their whispers muffled beneath the roar of drums and bells. But when the last goblet was drained and the final candle guttered low, the celebration gave way to silence. The time had come for the bride and groom to be led into their chamber. The room was prepared with all the splendor of royalty. Silk sheets, perfumed air, tapestries stitched with golden thread. To the outside world, it was a chamber of honor, the beginning of a queen's life. But to those who knew the truth, it was a prison draped in velvet. The king entered first, his steps steady, his expression unreadable. He was not a man approaching his granddaughter, but a sovereign approaching his duty. Behind him, the girl was ushered in, her veil lifted away, her face pale and drawn, her hands clenched tightly at her sides, her body stiff as if resisting even the air around her. The attendants withdrew, the heavy door closed, and the palace exhaled in silence. What passed within that chamber, history does not describe in detail, but it does not need to, for the horror lay not in the act itself, but in the truth that it was sanctioned, celebrated, and blessed. By morning, the court spoke of it as if it were destiny fulfilled. Servants gossiped of the girl's pallor, of the king's composure, of the uneasy quiet that hung over their chamber long after dawn. Courtiers exchanged cautious glances, their words carefully chosen, for to speak openly was to invite danger. Officially, it was a triumph. The dynasty secured, the bloodline strengthened. Unofficially, it was a scandal so grotesque that even those who live by scandal felt its weight. And yet, within the twisted logic of royal politics, it was not without precedent. Across Europe, dynasties had practiced similar unions for centuries. Uncles married nieces, cousins wed cousins, brothers-in-law became husbands to their own kin. The Habsburgs had perfected the art of incest, believing that to mix blood with outsiders was to weaken their divine right. The Church, which might have condemned such unions, instead bent its doctrine. Dispensation after dispensation was granted, turning what should have been sin into sacrament. But while priests could bless and kings could command, the human cost could not be hidden. Generations of inbreeding had already left their mark. Children were born frail, diseased, or mentally impaired. Entire dynasties collapsed beneath the weight of their own purity. And for the granddaughter, who now found herself queen, the price was her life, her body, her freedom, her very identity reduced to a vessel for political survival. Inside the palace, her isolation deepened. She could not turn to her family. They had been the architects of her fate. She could not turn to the church. It had sanctified her betrayal. Even among the women of the court, she found no refuge. Some pitied her in silence, others envied her crown, and a few whispered against her, hoping to see her replaced. Every smile was a mask, every kindness a trap. She was surrounded by people, yet she had never been more alone. Still, she endured. For what choice did she have? Like so many royal daughters before her, she learned to silence her pain, to bury her terror beneath the weight of ceremony. She appeared at feasts, her face painted into serenity. She walked beside her grandfather king, her body cloaked in jewels that felt like chains. To the world, she was queen. To herself, she was captive. And in the corridors of the palace, the whispers grew. Some said the union was cursed, that God himself would not suffer such a marriage to last. Others claimed it was only the beginning, that the dynasty would bind itself ever tighter, choking on its own blood. But beneath every whisper lay the same unspoken truth. The granddaughter's suffering was the price of the king's ambition, and her silence was the foundation of his power. As the months turned into years, the question was no longer whether the marriage would endure. The question was what it would produce, and whether the bloodline, already poisoned by generations of obsession, could bear the weight of yet another sin. The palace waited for news of heirs. In the logic of dynasties, the horror of a marriage could be excused if it secured the bloodline. A child born of the union would silence critics, strengthen alliances, and justify every prayer whispered over the cathedral altar. And so, the granddaughter's body became not her own, but the stage upon which a dynasty's survival would be tested. Months turned into anxious seasons. Courtiers whispered of her health, watching her every gesture, every faint smile or weary sigh. When she appeared pale, rumors spread of pregnancy. When she remained unchanged, mutters of failure crept through the corridors. The king, firm in his resolve, demanded patience. The priests assured the court that God would bless this union, for had not the Pope himself sanctioned it? Yet behind the solemn assurances lay unease. For even if a child came, would it be healthy? Generations of inbreeding had already left their mark on the Habsburgs. Historians today can trace the family's decline in bloodlines as clearly as soldiers trace a retreat on a battlefield. The infamous Habsburg jaw, elongated, heavy, grotesque, was only the outward sign of deeper decay. Children died young, heirs grew frail, kings struggled with madness, and the granddaughter was no exception to this curse. She was young, but her health faltered beneath the strain of her marriage. Servants reported her frequent fainting spells, her long silences, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. The court spoke of her as if she were both queen and patient, her body dissected in whispers. Each banquet she attended brought a storm of speculation. Was she carrying the future of Spain within her womb, or was her silence another sign of failure? But beyond the palace, the people murmured something darker. In the marketplaces, in the taverns, in the narrow streets of Madrid, they whispered of punishment. God has turned his face, some said. This marriage is an abomination. No kingdom built on such sin will stand. The clergy, bound by loyalty to the crown, dismissed such talk as superstition. Yet even they hesitated, for they had eyes, and they could see the decay spreading through the dynasty like rot in a tree. When no heir came, tension thickened. Nobles grew restless, factions hardened, and foreign powers watched with eager interest. Every year without a child was another year of instability, another crack in the foundation of Spain's throne. And all the while, the granddaughter's suffering deepened. Her role as wife had stripped her of identity. Her failure as mother stripped her of worth. Still, the king persisted. He had bent the church, defied morality, and silenced scandal. He would not be denied his legacy. Physicians were summoned, remedies prescribed, prayers repeated endlessly at chapels across the city, yet nothing changed. The chambers remained silent. The cradle in the corner of her room remained empty, and so the whispers grew louder. Perhaps it was divine justice. Perhaps God himself had cursed the Habsburgs for their sins. Some courtiers recalled Charles II, the bewitched king whose broken body had been the final proof of centuries of inbreeding. Others pointed to the granddaughter's frailty, her quiet despair, as another sign that the bloodline was collapsing. But for the granddaughter, the curse was not abstract. It was lived in her body, her silence, her endless nights staring into the darkness. She was queen in name, prisoner in truth, and failure in the eyes of a court that demanded her womb succeed where generations had already failed. One winter night, as snow drifted against the palace walls, a servant overheard her whisper to herself. "Perhaps it is not I who am barren," she said softly, her voice breaking. "Perhaps it is this dynasty." The words spread quickly, carried on hushed lips, repeated in the kitchens and corridors. A dangerous thought, but one that rang too true to be dismissed. For even kings cannot escape the reckoning of blood. The years that followed were marked not by stability, but by decay. The marriage that had been meant to secure the throne became instead a symbol of weakness. Whispers of scandal could no longer be silenced. They clung to the dynasty like smoke to burned wood. At court, factions sharpened their knives. Some nobles supported the king blindly, terrified of his wrath. Others murmured that his obsession with bloodline had doomed the realm, that alliances with foreign powers, once possible through marriages beyond Spain's borders, had been squandered in the name of purity. Every decision he made was weighed not only against politics, but against the grotesque shadow of his marriage. Foreign ambassadors, writing back to their monarchs, noted the unease. Letters survive describing the granddaughter queen as a pale figure, always silent, always guarded, and the king as a man consumed by his own dynasty, blind to the crumbling of his kingdom. The marriage was no longer a private scandal. It had become a spectacle across Europe. Inside the palace, the granddaughter's health declined. Physicians prescribed endless remedies, tonics brewed from rare herbs, bleeding to release bad humors, pilgrimages to shrines said to bless barren women. Nothing worked. Her body grew weaker, her spirit more withdrawn. She moved through the halls like a ghost, her crown heavy upon her brow, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. And still the king pressed her. In him burned not love, not even companionship, but desperation. His dynasty must endure. His bloodline must remain unbroken. He clung to her with the iron grip of obsession, demanding what nature could no longer give. The bedroom, once meant to secure heirs, became instead a chamber of torment. For the granddaughter, every night was another reminder that she was both queen and captive, wife and child, prisoner and pawn. Beyond the palace walls, Spain itself faltered. Wars drained the treasury, famine stalked the countryside, and the people's faith in their rulers wavered. The curse of the Habsburgs, some called it, pointing to the decay of both bloodline and kingdom. Priests, once quick to defend the marriage, now spoke cautiously, their sermons filled with warnings of divine wrath. Even the church began to distance itself from what it had once sanctified, and through it all, the granddaughter bore the weight. She was paraded at ceremonies, her body draped in jewels, her lips forced into brittle smiles. But those who looked closely could see the truth. The queen was fading. The girl who had once been a granddaughter, stolen from innocence, was now a woman hollowed by duty, her youth consumed by a crown that had never been hers to choose. At night, when the palace grew silent, she would walk alone in the corridors, her footsteps echoing against stone. Servants spoke of seeing her pause before the portraits of her ancestors, the long line of Habsburg kings and queens whose twisted faces and tragic fates stared down from the canvas. They said she would linger there, staring into their painted eyes, as if searching for a fragment of herself among the ghosts of her blood. And perhaps she did. For what was she but another name in a dynasty's endless chain of sacrifice? Another body given to keep a throne intact, another soul broken in the service of power. By now, even the king's supporters began to question him. His health was failing, his decisions erratic, obsessed with legacy. He had bound himself to an act so monstrous that even loyal nobles recoiled. Yet still he clung to the granddaughter he had made his bride, blind to the suffering etched into her face. One night, as storms raged outside the palace walls, thunder rolling like cannon fire across the sky, a servant overheard the granddaughter whisper again, not to herself this time, but to her God. "If this is the cost of crowns," she murmured, her voice trembling in the dark, "then let them fall." The servant fled before he could hear more, but the words, once spoken, hung in the air like a curse, and for a dynasty already collapsing under the weight of its own blood. They were words that seemed less a prayer than a prophecy. The prophecy lingered, though no one dared repeat it aloud. If this is the cost of crowns, then let them fall. And fall they did. The king's health began to wane. Once steady, his hand trembled on the scepter. His speeches grew rambling, his judgment clouded. Those who had once feared him now pitied him, for he seemed less a sovereign and more a shadow, a man consumed by his own obsession. Whispers spread that God himself had turned away, that the marriage which defied nature had summoned divine wrath. The granddaughter, now queen in name only, bore the decay in silence. Years of strain had carved lines into her face, her once bright eyes dulled by sorrow. She appeared at court, veiled and solemn, her presence little more than a symbol of endurance. Yet even in her silence, she became a figure of legend. To the people, she was both victim and warning, the living proof of what ambition could destroy. Beyond the palace walls, Spain staggered beneath the weight of decline. Wars lost, territories slipping from grasp. The treasury emptied into the abyss of endless conflict. Famine gnawed at the countryside, rebellion flickered in the provinces, and foreign powers circled like vultures. The marriage that had been meant to secure the dynasty had instead come to symbolize its collapse. And then, as if fate itself had decided enough was enough, the line began to break. Heirs failed. Children were stillborn, weak or barren. The Habsburg dynasty, once the mightiest in Europe, withered before the world's eyes. By the time the king drew his final breath, his throne was already crumbling. History records his death as the end of an era, but his legacy lingered like a stain. The granddaughter, widowed and broken, faded into obscurity. Some say she retreated into piety, spending her days in prayer for sins that had never been hers. Others claim she wasted away in silence, her body as fragile as the bloodline she had been forced to preserve. Her name was spoken less and less, until it vanished into the margins of chronicles, overshadowed by the enormity of the scandal. But the story did not vanish. In every court across Europe, it became a cautionary tale. Foreign envoys wrote of it with horror. Priests muttered of it as divine punishment. Commoners told it in hushed tones, shaking their heads at the folly of kings who placed ambition above God and nature. The dynasty itself became a warning carved into history, that power without limits consumes itself. The bloodlines, chained by obsession, rot from within. The pure blood, the Habsburgs, so desperately protected, had become their poison. Their crowns, once the envy of the world, had become symbols of decline. And so the story of the king who married his own granddaughter endures, not as romance, not as strategy, but as tragedy. A tale of how thrones can corrupt, how crowns can blind, and how dynasties, no matter how powerful, cannot escape the reckoning of their own sins. Tonight, as you lay in the quiet, imagine her, the granddaughter queen, a girl who should have been free to live, to choose, to love, but who instead was bound by blood and betrayed by family. Her crown was a chain, her palace a prison, her marriage a scar upon history. The bells that once rang for her wedding have long since fallen silent. The velvet halls where she walked are dust. The dynasty that consumed her has crumbled into memory. But her story, whispered through the ages, still asks the same question. What is the cost of power, and who is forced to pay it? And in the echo of that question lies the true legacy of the king who married his own granddaughter.